at the same rate of speed. Yeah, that's kind of different from engines of today, isn't it? Yeah, well, this was pretty neat. It got 1 horsepower for every 3 pounds when this engine came out. So it was pretty good. It was air cooled, as you can tell by the fins and by it spinning with the prop blowing air back that helped cool it down. But with that engine spinning, that created a couple little problems. Number one, it has 100% oil loss. You couldn't keep oil in this. Number two, it had no carburetor. How do you control the speed? Well, they controlled the speed with what they called a blip switch. It was a button that was on the control stick for the pilot. When he wanted to, this engine was running, and when he wanted to slow down, he hit that blip switch. That would kill the magneto on that engine, and the engine would stall. But it would continue to spin. When he'd get down to the speed he wanted, he'd release that, and that engine would fire back up. See? So there's only 2 speeds, on and off. Yeah. It ran wide open all the time. So when you started this, if you were the lucky guy to start this, you didn't stand there and look at this for very long. You got that thing started and you went that way real quick because this plane started moving right now. Yeah, if you listen to a lot of the old movies, you hear those engines. That's what they're doing. They're hitting that blip switch to cut it so they can slow down. Once they got out onto the runway, they'd open that up and away they go. They did the same thing when they came into land. But they were called daring young men. And the reason they were called daring young men, because it was very dangerous to fly back then. And the reason it was dangerous was because you had no exhaust system on this, and you had a wooden aircraft that was covered in cotton. Okay? And with no exhaust on it, where would it go? Back onto the plane and onto the pilot. Okay? Well, the pilot, that's why he wore those goggles to keep that hot oil out of his face, and that long scarf that wasn't to look, really a sharp fella. He used that scarf for 2 reasons. Number one, to wipe the oil off his goggles so he could see where he was going, and number two, he covered his nose and mouth so he wouldn't ingest so much of that oil that came out of the exhaust up there. The oil that they used back then was castor oil because it was a very good lubricant for this engine, and it didn't burn off with the fuel. And castor oil, some of us seem to know by the little snickers on their faces, was a great lubricant for the human body also, a great laxative. These engines would use anywhere between 2 and 3 gallons of castor oil in flight. Yeah. And now you know why they were called dashing young men, because when they got down and the plane stopped, they were dashing for that little half-moon shack that was on the side of the runway over there. Yeah. There were a lot of those along the runway, believe me. Sometimes they didn't get out before the plane stopped. So that was World War I. Now we'll move on to World War II.